the Evergreen Media Network studios. Brought to you by Evergreen Media, creating cohesive marketing campaigns. Evergreen Media in Vero Beach.
This is On the Move with McEvoy. And now, here's your host, Carolyn McEvoy.
Hello, and welcome to our podcast today. I am so happy to have Jessie Ray from the Treasure Coast Safe Families for Children with me. Hello, Jessie.
Hi, Caroline.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you today?
Good. Getting through the holiday season, I guess.
Just barely.
That's right. You're busy. You're a busy lady.
Oh, yes.
So you've told me this Safe Families for Children has been in business about 20 years. Why don't you talk to us about how you started with them and what you do there?
Well, Safe Families for Children started in Chicago 20 years ago, and our Treasure Coast chapter started in 2019. I've been involved for about 2.5 years, and it really, when I first heard the presentation about it, really captured my attention because it's both something that's relational and recruiting volunteers, really trying to get neighbors, helping neighbors. But it's also evidence-based. You know, I have a background in nonprofits, and so I know the value and the importance of research and making sure that there's a reason and a method to why we do what we do. And Safe Families has both of those things.
You've talked about the driving force that may lead people into foster care or a bad situation, children rather, is the epidemic of social isolation. So can you sort of pivot on that and tell us how that factors in?
Certainly. So what we know nationally, actually, about kids who end up in foster care is that about 76% of them are there for unmet basic needs, which actually doesn't always meet the true definitions of what we know of abuse and neglect, which is why children would end up removed by a child welfare agency. What we see then is that families are in poverty. And that can be relational poverty, spiritual, emotional, relational, oftentimes, and that they're in crisis. So something starts to happen, whether it's with mental or physical health. Maybe there's a, parent ends up incarcerated, or there's fire, home fire, things like that. Any kind of crisis that could sort of set a family on edge. And if a family does not have the social network to support them and doesn't know where to access some of those basic needs and some of those concrete supports, then what ends up happening is the situation can spiral to the point where child welfare can get involved. And so we want to get involved in the front end. So we really consider ourselves, it's much more prevention, a way to intervene and stop that spiral from happening.
And you mentioned to me earlier before the show about a particular situation, and if you want to sort of recount that, how, I forget which story, but go ahead.
Yes, so there's a mom, I will call her April, obviously to protect her identity, but she came to us, actually it was January of this year, so it's been a beautiful story to watch unfold throughout the calendar year, but she was in crisis. She was found herself to be a newly single mom of 4 children and was having some health issues, was starting to navigate those. And as the situation became overwhelming, she really found herself with deteriorating physical and mental health.
It happens, sure. They get overwhelmed.
That's right.
These
absolutely.
Are real
and
problems.
if you don't have friends or family or someone that you feel like you can call to really trust, when you're in that vulnerable space, we're really grateful for professionals in our community and the ones who will do job training or case management and mental health support. But when a family first finds themselves in that really vulnerable place,
it's more personal. It's more personal.
It's more personal,
yeah.
and you find yourself afraid of what might happen if you talk to the wrong professional.
You start getting isolated.
And exactly, right. And you end up alone and not sure where to turn. And so April called Safe Families. She was very overwhelmed. She actually thought she might need to send her children to stay with a volunteer for a little while because her health was so bad, she wasn't sure what was happening. But when she talked to our intake specialist, and what we really worked out together as far as her goals was that she really needed a friend so that she wasn't facing this crisis alone. She got to the point where she couldn't go out in public. She was having severe panic attacks, even just on short drives. And so she really found herself isolated and alone at home. So what this volunteer, which we call a family friend volunteer role, was able to do was to meet that mom where she was. So this wasn't a 9-to-5 office where she had to show up on time for her medical appointment, right? It was a friend came to her and would talk to her, listen to her concerns, help her navigate. Who did she need to call maybe to help with the children? Or when it was time for mom to have a medical appointment, she had a friend who would go with her to those doctor's appointments so that she didn't feel alone. Someone who could really be an advocate for her when she couldn't be an advocate for herself.
And she got out of crisis.
She did. We were thrilled when one of the first times, so several months later, mom and the volunteer met for lunch at a restaurant. And so she was able to go back out in public and she ordered her own meals, which was amazing. A few months later, April was able to re-enroll in nursing school. And then the volunteer was there with her and celebrated when she passed her first exam after enrolling in school. So April has actually gotten to the point now where she's feeling confident. Her children she got to stay with her children, so they're home together, they're thriving. She's pursuing her dreams again.
Which is wonderful.
And mom has actually decided to pay it forward and become a volunteer with Safe Families.
That's incredible. So now you talked about your use of a protective factors framework. Can you describe to me how you use that and what you do?
Yeah, so I won't go into all the boring research details necessarily, but what's great about it is, and I say this to our volunteers, it really gives a method to our madness. You know, sometimes people go, oh, relationship or a friend, like what is that? That kind of feels soft. That doesn't feel, like a program where you could really measure outcomes, right? And so what the protective factors framework gives us is the tools and categories then to work with our families on their goals. So it's things like social connections. It's things like parenting knowledge, social emotional competence of their children, knowing how to navigate support in times of crisis. So where can you get concrete support in your community? And then it's parent resiliency. So there really is an evidence-based framework behind how we're working with parents, setting goals, and then the activities that we encourage our volunteers to help with.
It sounds great. And I know the focus is on relationships, helping people that are in crisis, the adults of the family, to get back connected to society, and you're sort of normalizing their lives.
That's right. And a lot of what we get to do then, so our volunteers will be in relationship with the parent. The parent has to be involved. So this is not like an, babysitting service or an after school program where you drop the kid and we're just working with the kid and then they go home to the parent. We really are about trying to focus and support the entire family. So volunteers are in relationship with the adults. They can also help the children. Part of what sets our program apart is that we can actually host children in a volunteer's home without a parent losing custody. If there is a crisis like homelessness or something like that,
right.
If they end up in the hospital for an extended period of time. So that is something that we can do, but it is about helping them, connect and learn what it means to be in a healthy relationship, someone who really cares about them for who they are and not just trying to get something out of them.
Right.
So it's a whole reframing and modeling, about how to be in a relationship and then also modeling, how to parent well and bring that into their family so it can change the trajectory of their family over time.
Now, you mentioned this is the Treasure Coast chapter, and how do people reach you if someone listening to us right now needs help?
Absolutely. So we serve actually from Southern Brevard, Indian River County, St. Lucie County, Martin County, and they can call our intake line, which is 772-217-9066, and speak to our intake specialist. Just tell them their story and what their need is, and we'll get started with them.
And one more time with the phone number.
772-217-9066.
And that's Safe Families for Children. And again, I'm with Jessie Ray. Jessie, one other thing. You spoke about the difference between what you do and foster care, that your reunification rate is greater.
Yes.
Can you get into that a little bit?
Absolutely. So what we see so often is that, foster care ends up being, and again, not that there aren't some situations, right, that are unsafe and we want those children, in a sheltered home. but so often it's related to issues of poverty and finding resources. And so when we're able to support a family and then really help to strengthen and stabilize that family, what we see is that we're actually able to keep families together nationally about 95% of the time.
That's a high ratio.
Well, considering when a child ends up in foster care, our national rates of reunification are around 42%.
Wow, that's a big, big difference.
It is. And the cost of keeping a child in to taxpayers, to keep a child in foster care for about a year is about $30,000. Whereas we've seen, our average hosting is about 30 days now. Not that they can't go longer, but just on average, again, is about 30 days. And it's about $1,500 a hosting. We can provide a year of wraparound support to a family. So coaching, community connections, that volunteer support. We can do that for about $3,000 a year.
It's amazing. And now to move forward to funding, it is the holiday spirit.
Certainly.
You mentioned to me that people can also donate to your cause. How do they do that?
Oh, we would love that. If someone wants to make a donation, I would be happy to point them in the right direction. So they can call me directly at 772-217-5467.
Okay, and one more time again.
772-217-5467.
Very nice. So we've talked about what you do, how you do, and I know those volunteers, you're vetting those volunteers.
Absolutely. There's a full vetting process. We do applications. We have a volunteer training. We do level 2 background checks, and then we do home safety and interview and assessments and things like that.
What's the lowest threshold of problem to qualify for help with your organization?
We actually, we don't have income requirements or anything like that. So if a family is in crisis and they find themselves in need of support and are willing to work with us, then we're willing to work with them.
I was meaning sort of what types of problems. It's just when a child's acting out, or is it a legal problem? Is it just the isolation?
Oh, it can be a number of things. So there was a time once we try to work very closely with the Department of Children and Families, so if they see families who are in crisis, because they're also working to keep families together. They don't want to bring kids into foster care if they don't have to. So for instance, there was a grandfather who had custody of his grandson who ended up with COVID and needed to be hospitalized, but there was no family close by. And the rule is in the hospitals that if a child is present with an adult and they don't have anyone that they can call, then they have to call DCF. So the hospital is required by law to call DCF. Well, DCF knew that this was not a child who needed to be in foster care. And because Safe Families serves the Treasure Coast and we were an option, they called us. So we ended up hosting that child. It ended up actually just being one night before the grandfather was released. But it saved DCF and it saved that family what could have been probably several months worth of paperwork and issues to deal with simply because we were able to host a child overnight.
And you've mentioned, too, you work with or next to United Against Poverty. So you have good relationships with other programs out there. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yes, we can't, we're only one piece of the puzzle, and we know that, right? We want to focus on the relationship piece, and so we connect with as many community partners as possible. Our office is actually in the partner hallway of the United Against Poverty Center in Indian River County. So we work with them through their crisis stabilization, getting people enrolled in their grocery program or even their job training program. We're huge fans of STEP. And so a lot of our parents end up going through the STEP program. We also work with the Homeless Children's Foundation. We can work with schools can make referrals, or hospitals, other after-school programs. Another partner is the local shelters. So again, those families have shelter and they're getting case management, but they're often isolated. They often don't have family support. And so if mom wants to work, pick up an extra shift on the weekend while they're trying to save money, she has no one to watch the kids. So we might build a relationship with her and then be available to help, with extra care for the children. So we work very closely with our shelters. We work with the mental health organizations. And so it's, we see that need a lot too with the families that we're serving. So we do our best. And that's part of our professional role of our team, is to connect our families with whatever other concrete supports and community supports that they need to help stabilize their family and help them reach their goals.
Very nice. And you mentioned you're across Florida.
We are.
And you are also international.
We are. It's very exciting. So we have a chapter in the St. John's area, northeast Florida. We also cover North Florida through our Tallahassee chapter, Tampa area, and Miami-Dade. And then a number of years ago, we actually expanded into Canada, the UK, and last year we actually got to start a partnership with a mom's home in Hong Kong.
It's pretty exciting. Now, do you have meetings with regional people in your group to kind of share stories and...
We do. Our local teams connect. We have a director's call and, share stories. We're supported by our national office from Chicago, so they help us with, problem solving different situations and, strategies for recruiting volunteers and support like that. So, yes, even though we're a small local professional team, we are connected to our larger networks and helps us, stay motivated and remember that we're not doing this work alone.
No, you're not. I know you're very enthusiastic about it, and that's good. That passion drives you. What do you see in the future with your organization and children in general?
Well, we would love to grow our volunteer base. We know there's always a need, right? We can start with that assumption. We know that families are in crisis. We know that the pandemic really exacerbated things like housing issues, health issues, job security. And so if we can grow our volunteer base, we really think that we'll be able to make an impact on the number of children who end up in foster care across the Treasure Coast.
And I like something you said. You mentioned, and you are correct, in society today, the polarization of ideas and ideals, the separation, if you will, of people. Somehow you get to be unified because you're a 501c3, but you're not necessarily one religion based. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So we are 501c3, regular public charity, but what we really started as our recruitment strategy was going through churches. What we found is that even in foster care, and actually this happened in Chicago, when we started, the founder went to the mayor and, tried to get his blessing essentially, because it could look like we were interfering with child welfare. And he said, that's a great idea, but good luck, because we can't pay people to take kids in, right? So essentially meaning foster care doesn't have enough people signing up. And so what we really found is that if we work through churches, that's an appeal to people's faith. It's that sense of calling. It's that sense of responsibility to neighbor, a willingness to practice compassion, to practice generosity and hospitality. And so that is our main strategy for recruiting volunteers.
So a good segue, how can someone reach you if they want to start volunteering with you?
Oh, they can call me because that's under my purview as well. So again, phone number 772-217-5467. I would love to have you volunteer.
And they don't need special training. I mean, they need some later on, but they can just sort of start where they are and start with you.
Absolutely. So it's, they just go through our approval process, but you don't have to keep children overnight in your home. That's our host family role. And so we do, have that need, but we have a lot of people who start off as family friends. And actually right now, I was talking with our team earlier this week, we have a lot of transportation needs. So for instance, with our local shelters, there are, the moms have to work, the parents have to work. And a lot of them don't have transportation. And so we're grateful for our free bus service, but it doesn't always get there on time. There are limitations to that service. And so a volunteer could say, yeah, I'll pick up the kid and take them to before care, so that mom can get to work on time. Or I might be willing to give mom a ride for a couple of weeks, while she gets situated and we find another solution. So that's the other piece about our service and, part of the support that we provide. We do say that our assistance is temporary. So for instance, we're not a long-term babysitting solution. We're not the long-term ride solution to work, but we will work with the family, to resolve and strategize and, kind of find those longer-term solutions.
And you find that's been successful.
We have. We actually have some relationships that end up what we call it transitioning to a natural relationship, to the point where the volunteer and the family have connected so well that they really have become friends. They really have become like extended family. So we use that language a lot. It's like an aunt or an uncle or like a grandparent might step in, to help for short term while something was, happening within a family. That's what we ask our volunteers to do. So there's a number of different ways and stories that I could tell about how that takes shape. But over time, some of our families do find that they stay in relationship, and it's a really beautiful thing.
I mean, if I just talking with you today, what I've gotten out of this is that in our society, there's a lot of isolation.
There's a lot of loneliness.
And relationships are at the core, getting them back to relationships with work, family, their children, communication. Is that what you were saying?
Absolutely. We've said for years that relationship is the secret sauce. You know, relationships are always messy, whether it's with a stranger or in your own family. But that's where growth happens. You know, that's where we learn. That's where we grow as individuals. We get to see other people's perspectives and maybe even drop some of our preconceived notions or our judgments. That's honestly one of the most beautiful things for me that I've seen in some of our volunteers. They just assume a lot about why a family ends up in poverty, or, you know, why a family is in a shelter, or, you know, why kids might be behaving the way that they're behaving. And what we see is that when there's actual investment, you know, from a relationship standpoint with those families, that yes, it's slow and, you know, maybe doesn't happen as quickly as we want it to, but change takes place over time, and it takes place in the context of relationships. And it's been really neat. Actually, there was an article that came out in Forbes magazine last year that said, so it was addressed to the social sector, you know, take heed that it's actually a lot more about relationships, and maybe not so much about programming. That is really what leads to long-term change in families' lives. So the research was saying that families who have relationships with people in a cross socioeconomic status have long-term better benefits for themselves and their children.
And that seems to make sense too, because when any of us get in a rut, we're in that rut, and you need a helping hand to get out.
That's right.
To start or finish what you were starting.
That's
kind
right.
of thing. Yeah.
I mean, and when I need to change, you know, I say this in our training all the time. You know, if my doctor told me that I needed to lose weight, I'd be like, okay, thanks, doctor. But am I going to count on that doctor to be the one to help me get there? Or am I going to call a friend and say, hey, would you go without sugar for 30 days with me? You know, would you do this challenge with me? Or, hey, can we start walking the bridge a couple times a week? Right? It's my friends that I'm going to lean on for support. And so that's what we're inviting volunteers to do for their neighbors who just don't have anyone safe like that in their lives that they can trust and who's really going to invest in them.
It's true. It's a friendship-based program, which is really, really nice. I think that's super. And how many people do you have working with you where you are right now?
We have 3 staff on our team. We have over 100 volunteers right now across the Treasure Coast.
Yeah.
I think I have 15 in process, which I'm really excited about. So maybe they've done their application and their training, and we just need to do, you know, their background checks and home safety exams and things like that. We have served, so since 2019, we have served over 200 families.
That's
and
good.
Over 400 children have benefited. We've also seen, you know, we track things like how many parents are meeting their goals, you know, and how many families are reunified. I know just last year, because we do this data for some of our grant reports, that we had a 98% reunification rate this last year.
I mean, that's pretty amazing, really amazing. So,
yeah, and it really does, you know, and it's not just, you know, sometimes our volunteers can, you know, be worried that it's going to be all on them, but our professional team walks with you every step of the way. We assign multiple volunteers to a family so that it's not just, again, it's not just one person who's now helping this one person, you know, so we really do try to build what we call a circle of support around the family.
This sounds wonderful. And so, again, Jessie Ray, I just want to thank you very much for what you do. I want to do a shout out to the Safe Family for Children and all the volunteers and people there. And one more time, Jessie, how can they reach you?
They can call me at 772-217-5467. Carolyn, thank you so much for having me on today.
Thank you. And happy holidays to everybody from all of us at McEvoy Real Estate Company, wishing you a happy holiday season. Thank you.